I'm Victoria Dekker, Head of Growth for Psych, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Rick Doblin, Founder and Executive Director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. Rick, we'd like to thank you for agreeing to join us today, for your contributions to Psych, including your insight and your commentary in the second edition of the report. And moreover, we'd like to congratulate you on your recent and remarkable 35-year anniversary of the association.
Oh, Victoria, thank you very much. And just to let everybody know, in the next short period of time, Nature Medicine is going to be publishing the results of our first phase 3 study, which was tremendously successful. So
great. We'll be sure to watch out for it. So we're here today to celebrate MAP's achievements in the realm of psychedelics over the past 3.5 decades and look to the future of both psychedelics generally as an industry and MAPS as an organization. So we would like to start by asking you, what was the intention of the organization on conception, and how does that initial concept square with the direction that MAPS has taken?
Well, the original intention sort of was formed, not 35 years ago, but 48 years ago, when I was 18 years old and confused, 1972, and was confused a lot by my LSD and psilocybin experiences. And I just was looking at kind of a murderous world of the Holocaust. And I grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole idea that we could have nuclear war and destroy the world with the US and Russians, and then the Vietnam War from my own country. And it just seemed like, something that Albert Einstein was attributed to saying is that our technology has exceeded our humanity.
Right.
So it was out of that despair, I guess, that I kind of thought that the political implications of the unitive mystical experience were what people needed, that we needed to realize how much we have in common with everybody, and that if we can feel that and know that, then it'll be harder to commit genocide or murder or be racist. So it was this decision that I made when I was 18 after reading Stan Grof's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations of LSD Research, that in this crazy world, the contribution that I could make would be to try to become a psychedelic therapist, be underground, go through my own psychedelic therapy, and bring psychedelic research back. So that was the impetus ever since I was 18. So then when it comes time to MAPS, I had learned about MDMA. I thought of it as the incredible tool. It was the most gentle and very profound. It's the most gentle of all the psychedelics, but very profound. And so I felt that it would be the one that would make it through the society first. And so but the goal was, when I started MAPS, was a nonprofit pharmaceutical company. I didn't know that no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit at that time. So blissfully ignorant of that. That didn't happen until 1999, and it was the abortion pill, RU46. So it was another controversial drug abandoned by pharma and funded by philanthropy, by the Rockefellers, the Buffetts, and the Pritzker. Funded that. So the goal of MAPS, though, has been twofold. One, the main goal is mass mental health. Humanity as a group is crazy. We're destroying the planet. We're destroying the climate. We're murdering each other. There's a lot of reasons for hope, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So the dual parts are to medicalize through drug development research, and then also drug policy reform to move to a post-prohibition world. And so those are the two tracks that MAPS has always been on. And so now, 35 years later, we're on the verge of, in a couple years, having, hopefully, if our second phase 3 study goes well, having FDA approval, as well as approval in Israel and Canada. We're moving into Europe. Last Friday, we had the first MDMA session in Europe as part of our efforts to globalize, to bring MDMA through EMA. But we're also seeing changes in people's attitudes towards the drug war. And the recognition that mass incarceration has been racist. It's been a political strategy to take people's rights to vote away. It's never been about reducing drug abuse. So I think one of the questions for people in the industry to think about is the medicalization and the business aspects of that, something that is compromised if people can buy these drugs on their own in some sort of legalization system. Or, and this is my personal view, that the more that we destigmatize these drugs, the more we make them available to people, the more that we have licensed legalization, the more we train people in peer support, that we will sort of affect mental health more broadly. But we will also make more of a demand by people for going to trained professionals covered by insurance to get these treatments from all the different for-profit psychedelic pharma companies. But I think that there's a general sense among most of the companies that the drug policy reform puts their business model at risk. And I think that it's the opposite. I think that the drug policy reform will enhance and supercharge the business models by making even more people want therapy and treatment centers, even though we want to train people to try to heal themselves and also use it for celebration and for couples therapy, for all different kind of uses that aren't specifically treatment of a disease.
No, we'll talk a bit of what you just outlined in more detail. But in celebration of MAPS, I would love your perspective. Of all MAPS achievements to date, which will the group be most remembered for?
Well, I think mostly it will be making MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD into a medicine. I think that's going to have the biggest impact. I think that we are also moving forward. Well, we opened the door to LSD research after roughly 35 years of suppression. We've done early work with ibogaine, even ayahuasca in the treatment of addiction. But I think we'll be most remembered for medicalizing MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. Plus, we've raised over $100 million in donations in the history of MAPS, and about 75 million of that has gone for MDMA for PTSD research.
It's remarkable. I would agree that you will definitely be remembered for those things. And so just shifting gears a little bit.
Before we do, let me just say that our ultimate goal is not to be remembered for stuff, it's to be taken for granted. So what I mean by that is that, so a lot of women in America, when they go to vote, they just go to vote, right? They don't think about the people that were beaten up, that were arrested, just 100 years ago to get women to vote. So that the ultimate success, in a way, is to be taken for granted. Oh, it's always been this way. And of course it should be this way. So that's what we hope. Even more than being remembered is that people just go to their psychedelic clinics and get psychedelic therapy, or go get their psychedelics on licensed legalization and then go off to a party, and that they won't even think a second about MAPS.
So certainly a refreshing perspective. So just shifting gears a bit, in recent years, we have witnessed an evolution in funding and talent into psychedelics. How have both of those changed in recent years since MAPS inception, and what role has MAPS had in that evolution?
Yeah, well, and we're also, I'll start by saying that in some ways we're a victim of our own success. And by that I mean that of the 35 years, it's taken us 35 years to raise 100 million. Of that, in the last 2 years, we've probably raised 45 million, which is pretty amazing. But the for-profit companies have raised over $1 billion. And so what has fundamentally changed is that for the first 31, 32 years of MAPS's history, nobody would even think about a business model because the regulatory obstacles were too great. The public attitudes were too fearful. It just didn't seem like it could be done in a business way. Nobody would take that risk. So the fundamental shift that has happened as we've made research progress with MDMA, as other groups have made progress with psilocybin research, that we've shifted key opinion leader attitudes, we've shifted attitudes at the regulatory agencies, we've changed public opinion, which has permitted now the rise of the for-profit companies. And what's that done, when I said the victim of our own success, is that Now we're finding that a lot of people want to invest rather than donate.
Sure.
So how we tell the story of the nonprofit model and why that is worth sustaining at the same time that we're supportive of for-profit companies, as long as they are not doing overbroad patents, aggressively trying to block other people from doing things. But I think that's the big change that's happened, is the rise of the for-profits, the fact that, Psych even exists and your industry reports. That's new and really exciting.
We'd agree 100%. And so on the subject of IP and patents, there's been a lot of discussion around it lately, around IP ownership and patents generally. Psychedelics now appear on a wide range of patent applications, some you may not even expect. And many prominent figures are vocal in their opposition from an ethical standpoint. Where does MAPS take position on that subject today?
Well, we're pretty nuanced, I would say, so that I'm not opposed to patents for new inventions. I mean, that's a legitimate use of the patent system. And I understand also that investors want to see that. It's very expensive to make drugs into medicines. It's very expensive to do psychedelic clinics. And so people want to patent their inventions. What I see as problematic is that patents are being often, it seems like, used not just to patent original inventions, but taken for granted, you could say, in the business model, as you try for overbroad patents, you force your other people, your quote competitors, to spend a lot of money to try to narrow down your claims, and then you end up with something smaller than what you originally applied for. But I think that's really not appropriate for psychedelics. I think that people should be patenting their original inventions, but not try to go beyond and use kind of an aggressive patent strategy. So I'm sympathetic with patents, but I'm also worried, for example, how many things that are prior art are being discussed as people trying to patent.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Now, let me say that the other thing is that there's another mechanism that I don't think people recognize exists enough, that provides incentives for developing drugs into medicines without patents. It's for drugs that are off patent, and it's called data exclusivity. So it's a very important, different tool that doesn't require patents or IP, that if you are the first to make a drug into a medicine that's off patent, and all the classic psychedelics are off patent, and we've done a lot about the anti-patent strategy for the uses of it. But if, for example, we make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD, we'll get automatically 5 years of data exclusivity. And what that means is that nobody can use our data to market a generic for 5 years. If we do pediatric studies, we get an additional 6 months, and it blocks a generic competitor from even applying till that's over, and it takes FDA at least 6 months to review the application. So the way it's different than a patent is that some other company, if they wanted to generate their own data, they could do that. It doesn't block anybody from doing anything, but since it'll take 5 or 6 years and well over $100 million for somebody to make their own data for MDMA for PTSD, we don't think that they'll do that, and so we'll have this probably 6 years. In Europe, it's 10 years of data exclusivity. So I think that there's been not enough attention paid to this idea of incentives that have been created for drugs that are off patent or for uses that are in the public domain. There are process patents that are for how you make the drugs, but in general, I think they're more of an illusion of value. I think investors like to see that, but there's so many different inventive chemists that could figure out different ways to make things, and that even if you have optimized the cost of and reduced it to make it in some way, most of the cost of this treatment is going to be to the therapists, not to the drug. And so maybe you have a marginally different cost structure if you make it, and you've patented some production processes, but I don't think it's actually that significant when it comes to the patients and to the insurance companies.
I see. And been discussing a bit, this idea of raising capital.
Yeah.
Many companies are working to do this right now, attempting to raise capital for research and product development. It's taken MAPS, 35 years to get to your current position, acknowledging, that there's been a lot of movement in the sector generally over the past handful of years. But I'm wondering, is what these new companies, is what they're proposing to do possible within their projected timelines and capacities? And what questions should smart money be asking?
Well, one of the things that I think has really contributed to MAPS's success and also to our competitive cost structure, you could say, is that we have built our own drug development company. We're 130 people now. Around 2/3 of them are in the MAPS Public Benefit Corp, and that's the pharmaceutical arm, and the other are in the MAPS nonprofit. But most pharmaceutical companies, most of these new companies can contract out with what are called CROs, contract research organizations. So a lot of these for-profit companies, you don't need to have your own drug development team. You contract that out to companies that do this all the time. So I think what smart investors really need to be thinking about is, first off, the cost structure. It is more expensive when you contract out like this than when you build it on your own. But that's a lot of work. The other part is really to think about what is the niche? What is the actual product that people are talking about? And how does it really relate to the other products in the space? So, for example, there are several companies that are now trying to develop new molecules that they can patent. And several, Atai and Tacgen, are two companies that are trying to develop new MDMA-like molecules. So if they succeed, you need to make the question, yes, they can get a patent on it, but how different is it going to be from MDMA? And, maybe it's shorter acting, or maybe they figure that they can do it milder. So the idea would be you take it at home on your own and you process stuff without therapists. That seems very dubious to me. But I think you can make a great story about what you're going to develop with these new molecules, but how is it fundamentally different than what's going to be available from psilocybin? Mm-hmm. So Field Trip, for example, has talked about how they have a shorter acting psilocybin like molecule, and they've got a patent on it, and they're going to develop it. So it's an interesting thought. Can you have a 2-hour session instead of a 6-hour session? And how productive will that be? Will you need 3 2-hour sessions to equal 1 6-hour session? Or, so it's not clear to me that shorter acting molecules are going to be a big breakthrough. But maybe. So there's a bit of a gamble there. The other part I think smart investors need to realize is that there's so much fundamentals that are shifting. So right now, insurance companies don't have a code for an 8-hour session, meaning, we're going to have to create new agreements with insurance companies to get them to cover an 8-hour MDMA session. But I think that's going to come because what they're going to look at is the outcomes. And if the outcomes are really good, and if the outcomes are cost effective, they will find a way to cover it. So I think some of these stories about we're going to get a shorter acting molecule, it's unclear to me whether that's going to really be a great business model, but it could be. So I won't say that it couldn't be. I think there's a limit to what people can do with apps or with treating people through telemedicine. We already now, because of COVID, everybody has learned a lot in research how to move as much as possible online. But for psychedelic psychotherapy, for us, for PTSD, I think there's always going to be a human component in person for the actual dosing sessions. But that's going to be a question. Is it a business model to give people these drugs to take home on their own and do through telemedicine? That's not clear to me. I mean, people are doing that with Spravato, with ketamine. That's happening. Whether it's as effective, it's unclear. I think also people need to really look at, and this is a kind of a difficult thing, but there seems you could say a lot of hype and froth in the market. So there has been an enormous increase in some of these companies' values, 10x over what they were just 6 months ago. So how much of that is based on actual earning potentials and stories? How much of that is based on hype? And so you can make a lot of money during a bubble, but how do you know when the bubble is going to end? What's the underlying value? And I think also people should be really thinking about cost effectiveness and insurance coverage, whether that's going to happen. But the thing that people need to be wary of there is that the pressure is going to be to reduce the cost, to reduce the amount of therapy, and try to make it more cost effective. But then what's going to happen? Are people going to be given sufficient support for the integration? Are there going to be people that are sort of brought stuff to the surface and then they're not held in as supportive a way, and then they go off and commit suicide or decompensate? So I think people have to be wary of these stories of how we're going to do one dose miracle cure, or people can just take the drug and do it on their own. So there's a lot of challenges, but I also think that there's an enormous opportunity, because the mental health crisis is, I'd say, the key crisis that we have in the world, behind even climate change. It's about people's fears and anxieties that become irrational, and then they don't want certain kind of change, prejudice wars. So I think people really have to be aware that the need is great, and that there can be multiple companies doing the same thing and they can all succeed.
That's great. And I'm glad that you mentioned MAPS membership. I was hoping to ask you about MAPS alumni.
Yes.
We know some of them have moved on to other projects and other ventures in psychedelics. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how that work aligns with MAPS principles, and are there any alumni works you'd recommend keeping an eye on?
There's Fluence, which is a group for training therapists. They're doing good. The challenge for us is that we don't have stock options. We're still in a nonprofit. We still are paying nonprofit salaries, even in the benefit corp. So bunches of people have been trying to, for-profit companies have been trying to hire away our staff, because they've got the experience and specialized experience with psychedelic assisted therapy and regulatory agencies, and they can pay right now more than we can pay. So that's a challenge for us. But I think that not all of them have gone to for-profit psychedelic companies. Moderna has hired a couple of our people away in the drug development process, in the actual CMC, the chemistry manufacturing controls, and project management. So I think that the MAPS membership, which is what we're hoping to build, is thousands of people. So we're trying to build the base, not just to have the big donor strategy, but get 10,000 and 20,000 members to build the organization that way. But for the MAPS alumni, I think that there is mostly now in training of therapists is where it's happening. I think we've had a lot of very mission-oriented people. And now that we're getting closer and closer to FDA approval, people are getting more and more excited, plus we're learning more. And so what we're trying to tell people is, at some point, you may want to make a transition to other for-profit companies, but your value is going to only increase over the next couple years as we get to the point of FDA approval. Once we've got FDA approval, then we've demonstrated success, we've all learned more. And so I think there will be a lot more interest in people hiring away and people going to other companies. But we're hoping to keep the team relatively intact as we go forward over the next couple of years.
So on the topic of transition, I'm wondering, from your perspective, what needs to happen for a significant cultural change in our approach to healthcare to occur?
Well, it's already happening. So the first thing that needs to happen to really bring psychedelics has been this attack on the drug war. and this demonstration that the drug war is counterproductive, it's racist, so the drug war is what's been suppressing psychedelic research, and it's been the kind of willingness of the FDA to open the door to that has been so important. But people relate to stories, so more than to data. So what's really going to be changing culture is more and more stories of people who are helped by psychedelic therapy, by ketamine, by psilocybin, by ayahuasca, by ibogaine. So, for example, we are now working with two members of Congress, Dan Crenshaw, who's a Republican from Texas, and Tim Ryan, who's a Democrat from Ohio, on a bill to try to give $25 million to the Department of Defense for psychedelic research and $25 million to the VA for psychedelic research for PTSD. That's only possible because these members of Congress have heard from so many people. Dan Crenshaw is a former Navy SEAL, and there are loads of Navy SEALs who have been going down to Mexico for ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT and for ayahuasca and for MDMA in our studies. So what's going to primarily change culture is stories of healing from a broad cultural base. Also, we need the key opinion leaders. So for that, we need the science, we need the data. So when the FDA says yes to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, assuming that happens roughly 2 years from now, that's sort of the first key proof of principle that psychedelic-assisted therapy can make it through the regulatory system. That will change a lot. Now, there's also neuroscience research. So the FDA doesn't require evidence of mechanism of action. They just require evidence of safety and efficacy. But the more that we have this neuroscience research funded by others and funded ideally by governments too, the more the mechanisms of action will be understood. So it looks miraculous and dubious from the outside that people take a few experiences with psychedelics. They've had PTSD for sometimes decades. In our first phase 3 study, we've had roughly 1/3 of the people had PTSD for 20 years or more. And yet 2/3 of them no longer have PTSD at the end of the study. So how does that happen? It's hard to understand. So the more that the neuroscience research can show neuroplasticity and new neural connections, people can then give credence, people meaning regulators, key opinion leaders, can give credence to, yeah, these changes, not only can they happen, but they can be durable. So I think we're going to really, see more of that developing. And then I think, in the stock market, yeah, when people see people making money on this, that's going to be a big motivating factor as well. And that will bring more capital into the field. Ideally, we will end up, the critical factor is going to be national healthcare coverage or insurance coverage. That's going to really open it up, because we can do all we can to get it approved, but if it's only to self-pay people, it's going to be a smaller market and smaller amounts of money will be made. So it's going to be demonstrating this in a cost-effective way and getting insurance coverage.
Sure, and a great segue into my next question, which is, in your estimation, what needs to happen in the healthcare supply chain to bring psychedelic medicines and therapies to patients in a significant way?
Well, we're already having discussions with various health insurance companies about it. And so I think that's going to be key. The good thing for us in Europe is that the national health care is there pay for treatment, but they also pay for disability payments. And so for PTSD, when you consider severe PTSD as very disabling, depression as well, the economic cost effectiveness study, makes more sense. In the Europe, we have the sort of, they pay for both. In the US, it's only the VA that pays for therapy and disability. Generally, insurance companies don't pay for it. The other thing I'd say in the healthcare supply, we're going to need networks of clinics. And one of the things that, multiple different companies are going to be doing is this kind of building out these networks of clinics. The idea that for us, it's not necessary, but we found it to be helpful for people to have overnight stays. so that you have an 8-hour session. It's very exhausting. We have people that do the integrative psychotherapy the next day. So if you have to go home and then come back and drive all this, so it's going to be optional. We have several of our phase 3 sites that don't have overnight stays, so that it is optional. But so developing the clinics that are optimized for therapy would be really important. That needs to really happen. As far as supply chains for the drugs, that part's easy. We've just now got 16 kilograms of GMP MDMA. People are doing the same for psilocybin. So the distribution is going to be easy. The thing that is important is going to be the negotiations with the regulatory agencies on what's called the REMS, which is risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. So those are customized policy tools for the risks and benefits of each specific drug. So they're going to say that the only people that can work with a patient are therapists that have been through the training program from the sponsor. So what we're going to really need for the supply chain, you could say, is the supply of trained therapists. We're predicting, or our modeling is that by 2028, we hope to have trained 23,000 psychedelic therapists for MDMA, for PTSD. And then they will set up all these clinics and all of that. But what is really important is to recognize that even though there are separate companies that are doing different individual drugs, some companies doing psilocybin, some doing ibogaine, some doing MDMA like us, that really the field is psychedelic psychotherapy. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to give these therapists tools to customize and personalize psychedelic medicine to their patients. So we're going to need to train therapists in MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, LSD, cross-train therapists. And so the big step is going to be getting schools of psychiatry and schools of psychotherapy embedding in their training programs 4-degree credit. There's starting to be now a few, like California Institute for Integral Studies. Sorry. CIS has a certificate program, but it's not part of their degree program.
Okay.
So we need to embed in degree programs psychedelic psychotherapy training. And then I would say that the early psychedelic therapists of the past, the ones right now who are operating, will all agree that therapists are more effective if they've done the drug themselves. Sure. So it doesn't mean that if you're a therapist who's done MDMA, you're better than a therapist that's not done MDMA. It just means that you're better than you would have been otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so we need to also figure out ways in a protocol, in a legal way, to give therapists training with their own experiences, but in a way that's not so expensive, that's not heavily protocolized and lots of data gathering. So that's going to be a real thing. So embedding training programs in schools of psychiatry and psychotherapy, including the opportunity for therapists to be experience the drugs themselves, that's going to be a real big limiting factor. Getting all of the clinics laid out and optimized, that's going to be a big thing. And then the other big thing to share is group therapy. So we really need to be, and we're now in the near final protocol development stages of a protocol for group therapy to take place at the Portland VA. So what that means is that these clinics, which may initially be set up for individual therapy, small rooms and patients and therapists together, we're going to need to optimize also for group therapy, so that some of these clinics are going to need larger spaces for groups. But we haven't proven the group therapy model yet, but I think that's going to be a big one going forward.
Great. And we have many investors, operators, and people generally interested in advancing the industry of psychedelics and improving access, watching right now. If you could give any advice, how can people get involved today to help research and industry evolve and progress forward?
Well, one of the things is still reducing stigma, for this. So I think we need a vast psychedelic coming out process. of people that have benefited from psychedelics to further change the culture. I just was before this doing an interview for a German magazine, because we're bringing MDMA PTSD research to Germany, and the fellow was telling me about how attitudes are changing. His mother in her 70s was a Holocaust survivor and was in a concentration camp, and but now she's finally thinking she might be ready for psychedelic therapy. So we need more of that. I think also we need people who lobby Congress. What we really would ideally want is more federal money for research, particularly for mechanism of action research and things like that, so people can be effective in that way. And I do think that this whole field is held back by prohibition. So I think that the more people can get involved in state and local efforts to either move towards decriminalization, to legalization, to the Oregon psilocybin initiative, things like that, I think that can be very effective, because it's been the prohibition and the stigma that has sort of blocked the acceptance of this, and as where there still are pockets of research. I think the other part is going to be, it's hard to think about investing, but religious freedom. So, we have this idea that if you're part of a group, like the Native American Church, they're legal for peyote. That went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The União de Vegetal for ayahuasca, that went to the Supreme Court. But there should be a way for people to legally make the case that you want to have a spiritual experience, but you want to do it independently. You don't need a religion as part of it. So all of that is on the theme of ending prohibition. The other is mental health parity in insurance. I mean, that if we can get that across more and more, that will fuel all of these companies, because if they're just relying on self-pay people, it's going to be limited, as we said before. So I think this idea of mental health parity in health insurance, if people can be working on that aspect, that will have a ripple effect throughout the whole industry of psychedelic businesses.
And so looking far ahead into the future, what does the world of psychedelic access and the future of MAPS look like in another 35 years?
Well, I am so glad you asked that, because actually we do think about what's happening in 2050. So, but I'll start by 2035. So right now, 2021, attitudes have shifted. Everything is open, but I think we're going to need a decade of psychedelic clinics rolling out, already it's happening with ketamine clinics. Then 2023, we hope MDMA for PTSD. Then 2024, 2025, or 26, we hope psilocybin comes online, and other things as well. There's people working on mescaline. But I think that we're going to need to have a roughly 10 years of rollout of psychedelic clinics. And that will end up being hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people treated. That will change public attitudes. And in 2035 is when I think we'll move to what we call licensed legalization, where you have a license to do these drugs in any context. It's like a driver's license, but it's different. So for example, alcohol, I think, is regulated too lightly, because you can buy a bunch of alcohol, get in your car, drive drunk, get pulled over, you lose your driver's license, but you still can go anywhere and buy alcohol as long as you're over a certain age, get in your car and you kill people. So there should be a license that can be taken away if you misbehave. And I think that will happen in 2035. We'll get licensed legalization for psychedelics. We also need to change the attitudes towards what we do about young people. So, these licenses will be for adults, but I think that there should be a parental override. If you want to give your kids psychedelics, you should be able to do it. And that is the way it's done with the Native American Church, with peyote, with ayahuasca. The cultures that have successfully integrated psychedelics don't have age limits. I was at a Native American peyote ceremony, and a Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son, who stayed up the whole night. He took smaller amounts of peyote, but we need to bring this back to the family. So 23 states in America have laws where, for alcohol, parents can give alcohol to their children. You can override the laws against minors. So we're going to need that. So I think 2035 is when we move to this license legalization. And then I think by 2050, the goal is to have a more spiritualized humanity. And, we're talking so much about climate change, and people are talking about net zero carbon. What we need is a world of net zero trauma. And I think if we can really globalize access to psychedelic healing, destigmatize it, and globalize this post-prohibition world by 2050, in a little bit less than another 35 years, we should have a net zero trauma world. And and also, we do need a big shift from fundamentalism to mysticism. So we've got people killing each other over different kind of religious ideas. You can't force anybody to have these experiences but hopefully if we have enough of a cultural context where people have had psychedelic mystical experiences, psychedelic unitive experiences, that we will see kind of a move from fundamentalism, which is literalism, to sort of symbolic, metaphorical mysticism. So hopefully that's where we'll be at by 2050.
Fingers crossed. Rick, we'd like to thank you sincerely for your time and for all the important work that MAPS has done over the years, and again, congratulate you on your 35th anniversary.
Thank you. And I'll just make an appeal for membership. So if people want to become monthly members, we don't need, but I would also make an appeal to all these for-profit companies that are making, billion-dollar market caps, or, making a fortune, that they should realize that what made this transition happen was the nonprofits, the Beckley Foundation, Hefter, USONA, MAPS, and that changed it. Then it made it so that now the for-profits could come into the environment. And so hopefully there will be some sense that as long as the nonprofits are sort of leading the way, that will make it easier for everybody. So I'd like to encourage newly wealthy for-profit psychedelic investors to make donations as well.
Great. Thank you for your time, Rick. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Victoria. Terrific.
You're welcome.